Great, thank you very much. So I'm here to talk to everyone today, as Amanda said, about procuring local foods for the USDA child nutrition programs. We're going to talk first a little bit about what does procurement mean, what are the USDA child nutrition programs that we're talking about, what are some of the requirements of those programs in terms of the types of foods that need to be served and the types of foods that can be credited to those programs. Then we're going to talk about the super fun part, everybody's favorite, federal regulations, and then some special provisions to those that apply specifically to the child nutrition programs. We're going to talk about some procurement considerations. Basically, how do these different types of sponsoring organizations typically buy their food? What opportunities are out there, and where could they be looking for local foods to fit in? And then we should definitely have ample time for questions at the end. So just to jump in first, we're going to talk about what we mean by procurement. In terms of our programs, it's the process of purchasing goods and services. All of the money that comes from the USDA child nutrition programs, it's all taxpayer funded. So there are a lot of regulations in place to make sure that these taxpayer dollars get spent responsibly. The big key takeaway, the fourth point there, free and open competition. The idea is, again, because these are taxpayer dollars, as many people as possible should be able to participate in these procurement opportunities. And that should be an advantage and give local producers an opportunity to provide their goods to sponsors of these programs. When we talk about the USDA child nutrition programs, they really sort of fall into three buckets in terms of the ones that our office administers. There are the school meal programs, child and adult care food program, and the summer food service program. The school meal programs cover kind of a wide range. Even though we talk about, oh, yep, school lunch, each of these is really sort of a separate program with its own regulations, its own requirements, and it really covers the whole school day, starting with the breakfast, national school lunch, after school snacks. The special milk program is one that is available to kids who may not have access to the national school lunch program, either because the school doesn't participate or if it's like a half-day kindergarten. The USDA makes this milk program available to provide reimbursement to schools for those milks as well. Basically, these programs all serve school-aged children in school, as well as residential child care institutions, juvenile facilities, things like that, that we may not typically think of as schools, but they operate as schools and are part of the National School Lunch Program, the other school meal programs. In addition to that, we have the Child and Adult Care Food Program. This program, not as many people know about this one as they do the school lunch, but this one serves primarily kids before they get to school. So preschool children in daycare centers or in licensed at-home family daycares. Also, school-aged kids, if they are in a before care or after care program. It also covers Head Start. One of the interesting things, because Head Start is another federal program, it's actually mandated that Head Start centers participate in this USDA Child and Adult Care Food Program. So any kids who are going to Head Start get meals through the Child and Adult Care Food Program. This also covers emergency shelters. So homeless shelters and things like that are able to serve meals and get reimbursement through this program. One thing that a lot of people tend to forget, there is also an adult component of this program. So adults that are either functionally impaired or over the age of 60 and enrolled in outside the home, non-residential day programs are also eligible to participate here. There are some additional considerations to think of, because most of the rest of these programs are focused squarely at children, but this is really one of the areas that we are trying to grow and expand here in Ohio, is the A in the CACFP, because there is really an older adult population that can benefit from getting these meals as well. The third main program that we administer here at the Ohio Department of Education is the Summer Food Service Program. This is meant as sort of a bridge to provide meals for those kids that would typically rely on receiving a free or reduced price lunch during the school year. The Summer Food Service Program is meant to help provide meals when school is not in session. This is a little bit unique because it's a little bit more flexible in how the meals are served. Most commonly, these are open sites. So they'll set up in a park or they'll set up somewhere else and say, hey, we're serving lunch at 11 o'clock. And any kid who shows up at 11 o'clock gets a meal. You don't have to fill out any paperwork. You don't have to do any registration. As the one receiving the meals, you just get to show up and get a free meal. So these only operate when school is not in session. It is primarily during the summer. They can also operate on an emergency basis if school is out during the rest of the year. Here in Ohio, we don't really see that. We just see these sites operating during the summer. There are a couple of other programs as well beyond those. There is the USDA Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program. This is a separate grant that schools apply for. It's only available to elementary schools, and it's only available to elementary schools that have at least 50% of their enrolled kids eligible for free and reduced meals. But the goal of the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program is to increase kids' exposure to fresh fruits and vegetables. So this specifically provides reimbursement funds for fresh fruit or vegetable snacks that are served outside of the regular mealtime. So this can't be, they just give them a little extra something at lunch. They actually have to go into a classroom, pick 1 day a week or 2 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever the school wants to do. And they actually go into a classroom, provide an identifiable fresh fruit or vegetable. It has to be something where, if they are cooking it, they should be ideally cooking it so the kids can see, and still providing, hey, we're going to give you some sauteed zucchini today. Here's what a zucchini looks like. Here's how we prepared the zucchini, and now you get to try the zucchini. So the goal is really to, like I said, increase kids' exposure because, especially with the focus being on schools with higher free and reduced populations, those tend to be in areas where there may not be as much fresh produce available in grocery stores. So by exposing the kids to foods that they may not see when they go out shopping or may not see at home, the goal is to get these kids more excited about eating fruits and vegetables in the future. There's also the Farm to School program. Those are competitive grants that are awarded by USDA. They're awarded directly to schools and other nonprofit organizations, groups of agricultural producers can apply for these grants also. And the goal of those is really to increase the availability of local foods in schools. One of the big things that we tend to see are things like school gardens and things like that. But Farm to School is not directly administered by our office. That one goes straight from the USDA out to the other organizations. But those are awarded annually. So that is definitely something to look out for, and definitely an opportunity to potentially partner with schools or other organizations to get local foods out there into the schools. In terms of meal patterns, so the meal pattern is basically the food requirements for the child nutrition programs. All of the programs that we do are operated on a reimbursement basis. A school or a daycare serves meals to kids throughout the course of a month. Those meals have to meet certain requirements. And at the end of the month, they report to us how many of those meals they served. For each of those meals that they serve, they receive reimbursement from the USDA. So in order for a meal to be creditable, there are 5 components that go into each meal: a meat or meat alternate, fruit, vegetable, grain, and fluid milk. Those are the basic 5 meal components. This applies to all of the child nutrition programs. Each meal has slightly different requirements for those components. Breakfast, for example, has to include a milk, fruit or vegetable, and a grain. A lunch or supper has to include all 5. Snack can include any 2 of the components. There are some additional requirements that may vary from program to program. We're not going to get too heavily into those, but that's just sort of the overview of what kinds of foods can be served. With each of those food components, there's a required serving size. In the child and adult care food program, that varies based on age, and it varies based on age to a smaller extent in the National School Lunch Program as well. But you might see that for a lunch, there's a requirement to have a half-cup serving of fruit and a half-cup serving of vegetables. The food buying guide, which is published and maintained by the USDA, is really the Bible for what is allowed to be served in child nutrition programs. Everything in the food buying guide, it lists every ingredient you could possibly think of, and explains how that food, when it's raw or when it's cooked, will contribute to the meal pattern. So one example that I like to give is ground beef. So we know that there are lots of different kinds of ground beef. You can buy ground round or ground sirloin or ground chuck, and those all have different composition in terms of the percentage of lean meat versus the percentage of fat that's available. And so the food buying guide will tell you that, hey, to get 2 ounces of to meet your 2 ounce requirement of meat, you might need to start out with 3 ounces of ground chuck if you've got a 80-20 ground beef, but you might only have to start out with 2.5 ounces of uncooked ground sirloin at 90-10. So it really gives great detail on how different foods credit in terms of the meal pattern. And anytime you are trying to get schools or daycares or anybody on this program to add something new to their menu, being able to help explain to them how this is going to credit and how this food can fit into the meal pattern will help them out quite a bit. Because, again, vegetables, things like that may credit differently if they are cooked versus raw, and being able to say, hey, here's what I've got, here's what we can offer you, and here's how it fits into the meal pattern. Because there are a lot of regulations. There are a lot of record-keeping requirements. There are a lot of things that go into running any of these child nutrition programs. And the people, we like to think of the lunch ladies. Lunch ladies have a lot of work to do, and people don't really appreciate how difficult that job has gotten with all of the regulations in the National School Lunch Program. So the more you can make somebody's job a little bit easier by saying, hey, I've already done the work for you. Here is how we can fit this into your meal pattern. This counts towards your red orange vegetables. This counts towards your dark green vegetables. The better and more likely people are to be able to include those foods into their menu. There are a few other considerations for foods that are processed or have multiple different meal components in there. So you may have something that is a combination of different types of vegetables. You may have something that's a combination of a grain and a vegetable. There are 3 options for how to determine how those are credited in the programs. The first is CN labels. CN is for child nutrition. That's a program that is operated by the USDA CN labels are only available for products that count towards the meat or meat alternate component of the meal. But there's a whole certification process that you go through with USDA, and they will give you a sticker to put on your box that says, you know, 1 3-ounce serving of this product credits as 2 ounces of meat alternate and 1/2 ounce of whole grains. The next is a product formulation statement. If you, as a producer of food, make some sort of product, you can use the food buying guide to determine how that product will credit in the child nutrition programs, and then you write up a statement saying, "Hey, here's my product. This serving size has X amount of this ingredient and X amount of this ingredient, and it credits as 1/2 ounce of whole grains and 1/2 cup of vegetables." And then you, as a producer, can provide that to people as an assurance that it meets certain requirements for the school lunch program. The last one is a standard recipe. And again, the food buying guide is a great source for this. They have sort of recipe builders that allow schools or allow anyone to develop recipes using the ingredients from the food buying guide. And the food buying guide will then tell you exactly how that credits in the child nutrition programs. So there are, that is really a great tool, I think, that we can use to, again, help these sponsors of programs incorporate new things, new ideas into their menus. I'm going to go back just 1 second to my slide with the food buying guide. The link is down at the bottom. I will try to make that available to everybody later. You have to sign up for a USDA account. It's called an e-authentication account, but it is available to anybody who wants to log on to the food buying guide. It's not restricted to sponsors of programs or participants or anything like that. Anybody who wants to can go to the USDA food buying guide website. They even have, I think they have an app where you can download the food buying guide app for your smartphone now. But it really is a fantastic tool for menu planning and nutrient analysis and those types of things. It's really a fantastic tool, and I would highly recommend using this because, again, I think it can definitely help add resources as we're trying to expand foods into these child nutrition programs. I mentioned earlier everybody's favorite part, the federal regulations. Anybody who's dealt with the federal government knows that they like to make a rule or two about things. This is really something where I go out and speak a lot about this to school districts and sponsors of the other programs, because procurement regulations are a big focus of the USDA right now. They are putting a lot of attention on proper procurement practices and procurement procedures. If anybody out there is familiar with gets federal money for any other programs and is familiar with the uniform guidance, that is a super hot topic right now, because everybody who gets federal money now, all of the grace periods are gone, and anybody who gets federal money has to follow the uniform guidance in the federal regulations for how they spend and report on their federal dollars. And again, that is a very, very hot topic with the USDA right now. The uniform guidance is found at Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, Section 200. And it has a lot of requirements in terms of procurement. Anybody who receives federal dollars has to have written procurement procedures and a code of conduct that governs anybody who will be involved in procurement transactions for that organization. They have to maintain records of the procurement process. There is a requirement to take affirmative steps to consider small and minority-owned businesses, and a requirement to award contracts to only to qualified suppliers. And these requirements apply no matter how big your organization is. And a lot of organizations are struggling with these right now. So if schools or daycares or any of our other sponsors seem a little bit unsure of what they're doing when they're trying to purchase things, it's because everybody is trying to wrap their head around these regulations. We at ODE are doing everything we can. I go out and speak at 3 or 4 conferences a year just on this topic. We take calls and emails constantly with people asking for help on procurement. Because, as I said, USDA is putting taking a really close look at procurement right now. So schools and other sponsors are taking a little extra time and looking a little bit harder at their own practices and their own policies and procedures. Again, the requirements in 2 CFR 200 are not unique to USDA. They actually apply now to all federal money. So anybody who gets any federal money from anywhere has to follow these same regulations. So these are the basic requirements that are laid out in 2 CFR Part 200. We talked about qualified suppliers. You may only award to qualified suppliers. That's those who are eligible, able, and willing. So as you're trying to identify potential suppliers of local foods, big one is eligible. Can they meet any legal or regulatory requirements? Do they have licenses and any permits that they might need? Can they provide any certifications that they might need to the schools? Able, they have to be able to have the resources to fulfill the contract. Willing, I know lots of people, willing is probably not as much of an issue. Lots of people want to sell their things. But in terms of being eligible and able, schools especially may have requirements for food safety plans and things like that, because they want to know that any food that they get in, dealing with a vulnerable population like kids, any food that they get in, they want to make sure that the producers have HACCP plans and GMP plans and things like that in place to make sure that anything that they're getting in from their suppliers is safe. So there may be things like that to think about in terms of purchasing food from local suppliers. The procurement regulations lay out 2 basic types of procurement. Those are divided by a dollar amount. These dollar amounts recently went up. It's called the Simplified Acquisition Threshold. It's currently set at the federal level at $250,000. So according to the federal regulations, any purchase that you make less than $250,000 is an informal purchase or a small purchase. You don't have to publicly advertise it. You don't have to go through any formal procedures. Anything over $250,000, you do. You have to do formal invitation to bid, formal request for proposals, including public advertisements and everything that kind of goes along with that. School districts, daycares, may set their own, they may have their own policies. A school district may have a policy that says anything over $20,000 we have to go out to bid and do a formal bid for. So if they set a lower threshold, then that's really what applies. But at a federal level, this is sort of where it is. There are also a couple of special provisions in the regulations that only apply to the child nutrition programs. These are not part of the uniform guidance. These are specific to the USDA programs. So geographic preference applies to all child nutrition programs. It's an optional preference that you can apply during a procurement in an effort to procure more local goods. The Buy American requirement is only for the school meal programs. It does not apply to child and adult care. or the summer food service programs, it is a regulatory requirement. There's no option on Buy American. You can't ignore it if you don't feel like dealing with it. It is a requirement, whereas geographic preference is an option. So the geographic preference option in procurement, it applies to unprocessed local agricultural products. What that means, we'll get into in just a second. The way this works, it's a preference applied to a procurement. So if you're doing an informal procurement, you're just getting quotes, or even if you're getting formal invitations to bid, you can apply this as a discount on the evaluation. So if you could say, hey, I'm looking to buy local apples. Give me your quote, your price per pound on 100 count local apples. And if you quote me local apples from this area, then I will give you 5 cents per pound as a preference discount. And so what that would mean is if one bid came in for not local apples, and it came in at $1.03 per pound, and a bid came in for local apples at $1.06 per pound, you could give that local one a 5 cent preference on evaluation. So you would evaluate it as if the bid came in 5 cents lower than it actually did, which would allow you then to award to the local apples, even though the overall bid price was higher. If you're doing a request for proposals, you would incorporate the local portion into your evaluation criteria. So you would say, hey, this is worth 10 points. Tell me what percentage of the apples that you're going to provide me will be local apples. If you say 100% of your apples will be local, you get the full 10 points. If you say, I know how much apples you need, I'm only going to be able to get half of that as local and half of it will be from somewhere else, you get 5 points on your evaluation. So it would work into the overall scoring and award of the proposal, and allow you to then evaluate and award to the best proposal. At the end of the day, the sponsor of the program is the one who has to monitor the performance. They're responsible for working with the vendor or supplier that they've selected to make sure that they are getting the product that they were supposed to get in terms of local. As I said, geographic preference applies to unprocessed local agricultural products. So we'll break that down sort of into its two pieces here. What do we mean by unprocessed? In the USDA's words, it means an agricultural product that retains its inherent character. Basically, it means you can't cook it. Anything that is chopped or diced or peeled or frozen or ground or milled, anything like that is fine. You just can't cook it or heat it. So nothing canned is considered unprocessed. Nothing else that's been heated anyway, with the exception of pasteurizing milk. Pasteurized milk can still be considered unprocessed for the purposes of geographic preference. Also, in terms of mixing foods, as long as the foods, each individual ingredient that goes into a mixture of things would qualify as unprocessed. So, for example, if you had something like pico de gallo, where it was diced tomatoes and diced onions and chopped cilantro and diced jalapeno peppers, that would still be considered unprocessed, because you can look at that and you can say, hey, I have all of my individual ingredients. I can see that this is still tomatoes and onions and jalapenos and cilantro. So there is still an opportunity for mixing things as long as each product retains its inherent character. The other component of geographic preference is local. USDA does not define local. They leave that up to the sponsor of the program to determine at the time they're doing the procurement. One important note is that when you are defining local, it applies to the source of the product, not the location of the vendor. So you can say, I want to buy local apples that come from this 4-county region in Ohio. You cannot say, I want to buy apples from a vendor that is located in my county. It has to always be based on the source of the product. And USDA leaves the definition open because in any particular procurement, it allows you to determine what your goals are in terms of geographic preference. Do you want to serve, really get into hyper-local farm to table and say, hey, for this case, local means produced in my county? Do you want to focus on the state? Local means anything produced in the state of Ohio. Or do you want to say, hey, I want to try to lower my carbon footprint for as much of my food as possible. So for me, local definition is going to be Ohio or any surrounding state. All of those are valid definitions of local because they are based on the source of the product. The one big thing, the fourth point here, you can't unreasonably limit competition. So if your cousin Bob has an apple orchard at the corner of Route 61 and County Road H, you cannot set your definition of local to must be produced at the corner of County Road 61, Route 61 and County Road H. That would be an unreasonable restriction on competition because then all of a sudden your cousin Bob is the only person who meets your definition. So whenever you define local for local foods like this, there have to still be reasonable sources of competition or reasonable opportunities for people to compete. The other one that I mentioned was Buy American. This is important because anything that is locally produced will automatically qualify and meet the requirements for Buy American. So the way this one works, as you see here, the department shall require that a school food authority purchase to the maximum extent practicable domestic commodities or products. This applies only to the purchase of food. But basically, an agricultural commodity isn't really defined in the regulations. Generally, they look at it as anything that can contribute to one of those 5 meal components that we talked about earlier, the meat, grain, fruit, vegetable, fluid, milk. Anything that falls into those categories generally would be considered the domestic commodity or product for the purposes of Buy American. The other option is it has to be either completely grown in the United States or it has to be processed in the United States substantially using commodities produced in the United States. So what that means is for unprocessed foods, they must be grown in the US, period. For processed foods, they must be processed in the US, and at least 51% of the final product must consist of food grown in the US. This is, like I said, this is a mandatory requirement for anybody participating in a national school lunch or school breakfast program. This is another one that USDA places a lot of emphasis on. And so, like I said, obviously anything produced locally should meet this Buy American provision. And so should be attractive to schools because they know they don't have to worry about it. There are a couple of exceptions that where schools are allowed to buy things that are not produced in the U.S. So if the product is not produced or manufactured in sufficient quantities to be available, or if competitive bids reveal that the costs of a U.S. product are significantly higher. So the example for the first one, where the product is not produced or manufactured in sufficient quantities, is bananas. Every school serves bananas. Everybody wants to have bananas. There are not bananas grown in the United States that can support our demand for bananas. So what that means is that every time a school wants to buy bananas, they have to record that they bought a non-domestic product and why they bought that non-domestic product. It makes for a lot of record keeping that nobody really wants to do. So the more they can not buy non-domestic products, the better. The other one competitive bids reveal that the costs of a US product are significantly higher. That one's a little bit trickier. Again, the USDA does not really define significantly higher. That is left up to each individual school or organization to define what is significant and what is not. So that could at times potentially be a barrier for local. If we're talking about local green peppers versus green peppers from Mexico, which one is going to be more expensive? How much more expensive is it going to be? And what is that going to mean to the school? Ideally, hopefully the school is going to want to, support local and purchase the local ones anyway. Depending on where they're getting their food from, that may not be a choice that they have. And we'll get into that more here in just a minute. So the last section that we're going to talk about here is sort of the procurement considerations. How do these different organizations, schools and daycares and summer food sponsors and things like that, how do they buy their food? When are they thinking about buying their food? And it really is challenging because for the most part, food is not the primary business of these organizations. They're providing meals, but they're providing them secondary to something else. School lunch, while it is very important and a hungry kid can't learn, schools are there for education, not for feeding. Daycare, you're taking care of the kids and yes, you're going to feed them while you're there, but that is not the first thing on most people's minds. So getting people to think about food can be a little bit difficult sometimes. For schools, most schools are still preparing their meals on site. They may be cooking them in a high school kitchen and sending food out to the elementary schools or things like that. But most schools are still preparing meals on site. There are some that work with outside vendors and order prepared, fully completed meals to be delivered to the schools. A lot of that depends on what facilities may be available, but the vast majority are still preparing meals on site at the school. One thing to think about with schools, they have to start thinking about their menus a year or more in advance. Because schools get foods directly from the USDA every year, they're eligible to receive food directly from the USDA. Those food orders have to be put in March, and we at the state at ODE, we actually have to collect all those orders from the schools, and we order the truckloads of food from USDA. Because we have to put the orders into USDA in March, it's usually February when we have to get the orders from the schools, which means probably back in January they're already starting to think about what are their menus going to be for the next year and what foods are they going to need. So trying to come to a school in August and saying, hey, I know you're getting ready to open, let's talk about some produce, that's probably too late. Because they really have to plan that far in advance. With the National School Lunch Program, they do require a larger variety of vegetables to be served. So there may be more of an opportunity to get sort of more novel vegetables and things into a school than there might be some of the other programs. There's a requirement with the schools to not just serve vegetables throughout the week, but they actually have to serve different types of vegetables. So over the course of the week, they have to have at least one dark green vegetable, at least one vegetable serving from the red-orange vegetable group, at least one from the starchy vegetable group, at least one from the beans, peas, and legumes vegetable group, and at least one from the other vegetables group. So there's a whole wide range that they have to serve. They can't just serve carrots and green beans every day and call it done. So trying to get local foods into schools, incorporating those different vegetable subgroups and showing how things can meet those meal patterns would be a big selling point for schools. One challenge is that schools a lot of times have one food service distributor that they get all of their products from. And they don't have a lot of time to go and try to call for people and get their fruit from one place, vegetables from some place, and get bread from some place, and get all their different things. It is like I said earlier, there's a lot of responsibility put on district food service directors, or we have a lot of very small school districts, and you may be dealing with somebody who is really just a head cook who's responsible for doing all this record keeping, doing all the procurement, identifying everything, and that person, if they've got a list of job duties to independently source all these great different local products, they're really looking for a one-stop shop. So the more that's available through maybe some of the more traditional food service distributors, whether it's a specialty produce distributor who just focuses on produce, or a more broadline distributor, that would make things a lot easier for schools to get local products. In terms of the child and adult care food program, we see a mix in terms of self-prepared foods versus vended meals. Another option for introducing these local foods may be not necessarily going to the schools or to the daycares, but going to some of these vended meal providers and working with them to purchase and incorporate and advertise, promote local foods. Hey, not only am I going to come in and provide your daycare center with meals that meet all the meal pattern requirements, but we're going to include all this local produce. We're going to include at least 2 servings a week of local produce. Most of the child care centers are small. They're not part of a network of 100 child cares that all have standardized menus and standardized ordering systems. I mean, it's one person who is going out to the grocery store 3 or 4 times a week to buy what they need for lunch that day, and then come back and make it. So it's maybe even a little bit more of a challenge to get that person to go out of their way to find local foods if they start their day by going in and getting the breakfast snack ready, and then they're covering a classroom while another teacher is on break, and they have to go out and buy food for lunch, come back and cook the lunch and serve the lunch and clean up after the lunch, and then cover one of the teacher's lunch breaks after that. Again, it's not a person who's going to have a lot of time to go out and do a lot of leisurely shopping, or is necessarily even going to be knowledgeable about where to find local foods. So that's certainly a challenge to getting local foods into the child and adult care food program. In terms of their menus, they're at least a little bit more flexible. We generally require them to post a month of menus at a time, but they don't really have to think ahead any farther than that, and it's not too big of a deal to change menus, not as big of a deal to change menus on short notice with the CACFP, versus a school lunch where you're planning, and you may have 4 elementary schools that are all on the same menu, and you've had to order that food a month or 2 in advance to make sure you've got it all in. Child cares tend to be a little bit more flexible, so things like I don't know, CSA baskets or things like that might be a little bit easier way to get the local foods into daycares and things like that. The summer food service program, summer is here and gone in the blink of an eye. That program operates, it gets going and runs so quickly that it is tough to keep up with. Everybody is very, very busy during the summer food program. Sites generally operate in June through August, like I said, when school is out. They may start their planning as early as February in terms of getting ready to plan their menu out and plan where they're going to get their food. The summer food program is operated, a lot of schools operate it. We see things like Parks and Rec departments here in Columbus. Columbus Rec and Parks operates 300 different feeding sites around the city. But we also have a lot of small nonprofit organizations that, again, this is not their primary mission and their primary goal, but they've recognized that it's an important program and provides an important service to the community. But they may not necessarily be experts in food service. One of the other big challenges with the summer food program is that the meals are often served in non-traditional settings. So you'll have people preparing meals and then trucking them out to a playground and serving kids at a playground because that's where the kids are. Kids don't have cars, can't generally get themselves too far of where they're going. So in the summer, you have to try to get within walking distance of where the kids really are. So in terms of packaging and transporting and what foods are really appropriate to serve, it's a little bit different in the summer because of the non-traditional settings. So I think that hopefully was an informational overview on how procurement works in the child nutrition programs, what kind of foods we look to serve, and how different things can fit in. Certainly happy to take any questions that we have.
Awesome, thank you. That was super, super helpful. That was really detailed. I think we had one question that you answered in real time, and there was one other question that's been submitted so far. From Joe Perlacki. It says, do you have any farmer food safety requirements such as GAP or FSMA, et cetera? So I don't know if you touched on that or not.
Yeah, no. So in terms of the USDA programs, we do not have any specific requirements that we put on for in terms of food safety or anything like that. But obviously there may be requirements that are put on by the Ohio Department of Agriculture or somebody else like that in terms of the same type of requirements that you have if you were selling food to anybody really. And then each individual organization may have its own requirements in terms of who they'll buy from and what they want to see in place. But in terms of the child nutrition program regulations, there is no specific requirement for farmers or any type of producers until you get into producing full complete meals. There are some requirements and some inspection requirements in the program regs for people who are producing complete meals, but that there aren't any for us.
Awesome. There's one other question so far from Emily Lipstrew, and she wanted to know, do educational service centers play a role in procurement, and if so, what is that role?
So educational service centers can certainly play a role in procurement. It may differ from school to school and from ESC to ESC. Sometimes ESCs do go out and or can go out and do competitive procurements based on schools that they represent. So, it could be that if you have several very small school districts, that maybe each individually don't buy a lot of any particular product, or certainly don't buy enough to make anybody interested in a discount or a good working relationship, that somebody like an ESC could come in and serve as sort of an agent to spearhead a co-op or a co-op or something like that of the associated districts and set up one master agreement on behalf that would allow for a little bit larger commitment in terms of product volume and things like that. There are some other sort of third-party purchasing agencies that are around in the state also that do some of this for schools as well. Although I don't know really what their involvement is, if they have any, in terms of specifically procuring local food.
So if there are any other questions, I would invite you to submit them now through either the chat box or the Q&A box. And if we don't have any additional questions in the next 20 seconds or so, we'll go ahead and wrap up. So we'll give it a few seconds to see. Okay, it doesn't look like we're going to have any other questions, but just as a reminder, this is a recorded webinar, so this will be archived. It will be sent out through the Ohio Food Policy Network listserv. If you're not a listserv member yet, you can visit ohiofpn.org and sign up for that. And then I want to say thank you to Matthew for doing this presentation for us. This was super helpful, and hopefully if you have any questions, Matthew will allow you to follow up with him. And for next month, our virtual convening for June will be covering the Ohio Smart Agricultural Plan, their implementation plan. So we'll hear from Ernie and their team on that. And so that's all we have for today. Again, thank you, Matt, and everyone have a good day.
Thank you.